The first thing Raquel noticed, the morning her left thumb came off in the sink, was that the water from the tap was warmer than her skin. She held the thumb in her palm for a long moment, where you might hold a coin found in an old coat. It did not bleed. It softened at the edges, where bone should have anchored it to hand, and slumped slightly in her palm, like a piece of cheese left too long on the counter. She set it on the rim of the sink. She turned the tap off. She did not scream, because she had been waiting for this for 6 months, and a scream is something you save for a thing you did not see coming. Outside, beyond the warped glass of the kitchen window, the sky over what had been Recife was the color of an old bruise. Firk's ships hung there the way clouds hang, 3 of them, low and patient, their hulls breathing slow. Heat shimmered off them in waves that you could see if you looked sideways. Raquel did not look sideways. She had stopped looking at the ships in month 2. The radio on the counter coughed, and began the morning broadcast in the smooth, careful voice of a man who had not melted. Citizens of the equatorial belt. Day 183 of the acclimation period. The Provisional Council reminds residents that the atmospheric recalibration is proceeding within projected parameters. Symptoms reported in the affected zones: dermal liquefaction, soft tissue displacement, vascular slippage. Remain consistent with thermal adaptation. There is no cause for alarm. Remain indoors. Conserve water. Do not approach the recalibration vessels. The broadcast went on. It always did. The man on the radio had been saying the same things in a slightly different order since the 3rd week, and Raquel had come to know the rhythm of his pauses like a song her grandmother used to hum. He never said verks. He never said occupation. Recalibration, the way her mother had once said, miscarriage, like a word built specifically to take up the space where a worse word lived. She picked up her thumb from the rim of the sink. She wrapped it in a square of paper towel. She placed it in the small tin box on the counter, beside the 3 teeth, the patch of scalp, and the long curling strip of skin that had come off her left calf in the shower 2 nights ago. Tin was beginning to fill. She had decided, keep all of it. She had begun keeping the pieces in the 2nd month, when a molar had come loose and landed on her plate during dinner. Plinking like a small bell against the porcelain, she had stared at it. She had washed it. She had not been able that night to throw it away. It had seemed monstrous to throw it away. This thing that had been inside her since she was 12, this small ridged piece of her own history, treated like trash. She had wrapped it in a square of paper and put it in the tin that had once held her grandmother's sewing buttons. The tin had felt right. The tin had felt like a thing her grandmother would have done. After that, every piece of her that came off went into the tin. It was not, she thought sometimes, lying awake in the long, damp nights, a healthy thing to do. It was not a thing a psychologist, in the old world, would have approved of. But there were no psychologists anymore. Or there were psychologists but they had been moved. Or there were psychologists but they were melting too. And Raquel had decided early on that she would not throw away any part of herself for the convenience of a council that pretended she was not dissolving. There was a knock at the wall, 3 taps, a pause, 2 taps. Bento from the apartment next door, still alive, still solid enough to knock. She knocked back, 3, pause, 1. Here, wake. The wall between them was thin enough that she could sometimes hear him cough at night, and she had begun, in the long, unmoving hours, to time her breathing to his. Bento had been a music teacher. He had taught violin to children at the conservatory before the conservatory closed. He was 61 and had never married and had, in the old world, lived alone with a small gray cat named Rubato who had died in the 4th week of the heat, of dehydration, in his arms. He had told Raquel about the cat through the wall, on the night of the 5th week, in a long, thin voice that broke and reassembled itself, several times before he finished. She had not said anything back. She had only knocked 3 slow taps. I hear you, I hear you, I hear you. And he had knocked back once, very softly, and they had not spoken of the cat again. The wall knocks had begun, between them, sometime in the 3rd month. Neither of them had proposed it. It had simply started, the way a path through a field starts. Feet finding it, then finding it again, then finding it always. 3 and 2 meant, I am awake. 3 and 1 meant, here. Wake. 2 slow taps meant, are you all right? 1 hard tap meant, yes. 4 quick taps, which Bento had used twice and Raquel had used once, meant, I am afraid, there was no signal for I am dying. T because they had agreed, without ever saying so, that there would not be one. If the knocking stopped, the knocking stopped, and the other one would know. The radio said, the Provisional Council thanks you for your patience. Raquel said, to no one in particular, I am patient. I am patient. I am very, very patient. She said it 3 times, because she had read somewhere that saying a thing 3 times made the body believe it, and her body, lately, needed to be told things. She walked to the living room. The fan in the corner turned slowly, pushing the wet air around the room without cooling it. The fan was a thing she had come to think of as a person. It was an old fan, white plastic gone yellow, the blade cage rattling slightly on the second of 3 speeds, and she had named it, in the 4th month, Ottavio, after a boy she had loved briefly in college. Ottavio the fan worked. Ottavio the boy had been less reliable. She told the fan this sometimes in the long afternoons, and the fan, being a fan, did not argue. On the coffee table lay the book. Vidas Secas Graciliano Ramos, the spine broken in 3 places. Her grandmother's name in faded pencil on the inside cover. She had read it 11 times since the ships came. She had begun, lately, to read it aloud. The way her grandmother used to, sitting in the rocker by the window, sweating through her house dress, reading about a family of starving farmers, wandering a cracked landscape under a merciless sun. Sertao, her grandmother, would say, tapping the page. They walked through fire, and they did not stop walking. She had been a small woman. She had buried 2 husbands and a son. She had, in Raquel's clearest memory of her, sat on a wooden step in the heat of January and said, Phila, the world will try to cook you. Don't let it. Raquel picked up the book. She sat down. Cushion was damp under her, and she could not tell anymore whether the damp was from the air or from her. She opened to the page she had marked with a Star Wars sticker peeled from a child's lunchbox in the alley behind the building. A small rebel symbol, white on red, the corner gummy. She had peeled it off carefully on the 11th day. She had not known why she wanted it. She knew now. She began to read aloud. The Verks came in the spring. They came without speeches. They came without ultimatums. They came the way a tide comes, without asking, without explaining, simply arriving and being present and reshaping the shore by the fact of their weight. Their ships settled over the equatorial cities of 3 continents in a single afternoon, and, by evening, the temperature beneath them had begun to rise. By 10 degrees, not by 20, by a careful surgical 4, then 5, then 6. Then, around the 3rd week, the sweating began to be different. People in Lagos noticed it first. Then São Luís. Then a small fishing town in northern Peru, where a woman ran from her kitchen screaming, because her wedding ring had sunk into her finger, like a coin pressed into bread dough. It was, in its earliest weeks, almost beautiful. That was the part nobody wanted to say later. The ships were not ugly. The ships were enormous and slow, and the color of wet stone, and they hung in the sky with a stillness that the sky had never had before. And the children, before the heat got bad, used to point at them from rooftops. Kel remembered her own niece, 8 years old, pulling at her sleeve in the first week and asking whether the ships were friends or whether they were not friends. And Raquel had said, "We don't know yet, Carita. We don't know yet." Because she had been a teacher long enough to know that the worst thing you can tell a child is a confident lie. First week, the cafes stayed open. People sat at the tables and looked up and talked. The newspapers, before the newspapers stopped, ran columns by men in glasses, who explained that contact had been long anticipated, and that the calm response of the species was a mark of our maturity. There were vigils, brief ones, mostly candles. There was a song that came out the 2nd week and was on every radio for 9 days and then vanished and was never played again. And Raquel could not now, if asked, remember the words to it. Only that the chorus had had the word "Céu" in it, sky sung high. By the end of the 2nd week, the heat was a thing in the room. By the end of the 3rd, the windows were closed. By the end of the 4th, the windows were taped. The provisional councils were stood up within 10 days. They were almost all the same men. They wore short-sleeved shirts and looked tired in the broadcasts, and used the word recalibration, and said that the Verks were not invaders but partners, and that the atmospheric work being done was, in the long term, a gift. The men in the broadcasts did not live in the affected zones. The men in the broadcasts had been moved. There were photographs that leaked in the second month. A council member in a cool linen shirt, glass of wine in hand, on a terrace in the highlands where the air was still the air it had always been. And the photographs disappeared from the feeds within an hour, and the people who had shared them disappeared within a day. And after that, no one shared photographs. The Verks themselves did not speak. There were no demands. There were no flags planted. There was only the heat, and the slow, soft work it did on the bodies of the people beneath it, and the patient hovering of the great breathing ships. A man Raquel had taught with, a chemistry teacher named Helio, a kind man with a thin mustache and a habit of humming Beatles songs in the staff room, had been the first person she knew to lose a part of himself. He had called her, on the 42nd day, from his apartment in Boa Viagem, his voice oddly thick. "Kelt," he had said. Raquel, my tongue. Part of my tongue she had not known what to say. She had said, "Stay calm, Helio. Stay in your apartment. Drink water. I will call again tomorrow." She had called the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. On the 5th day, a woman had answered Helio's phone and said, in a voice that was not crying because it was past crying, that he was gone. Kel had hung up. She had sat on the floor of her kitchen for a long time. She had not that night eaten. Later, the xenobiologists in Geneva, working from samples smuggled out in insulated coolers, would write the paper that explained it. The Verks, they would conclude, were a species that bred in geothermal vents on a world tidally locked to its star. They did not require human bodies, or human cities, or even human deaths. They required was a specific range of surface temperature for their spawn cycle. And the equatorial belt of the third planet from this particular sun was, with minor adjustments, within tolerance. The humans living there were not enemies. They were not even noticed. They were the small, soft creatures that happened to live in the warm, shallow tide pool the Verks had selected. That was in some ways the worst part. Not the cruelty, the indifference. A cruelty you could shout at. An indifference only kept being indifferent. The paper, when it leaked, was suppressed within 4 hours. The radio kept saying, recalibration. On the morning of the 185th day, Raquel lost a piece of her left ear. It came off when she turned her head too quickly toward the door. She heard the small, soft sound it made, hitting the floor, before she felt the absence on the side of her head. She bent down, she picked it up. It was warm. She added it to the tin. There was another knock at the wall, but it was not Benzo's. It was a single hard rap, and then silence, and then a woman's voice. High, thin, frightened, calling through the plaster. Raquel, is that you? It's Donna Elietti. From 406, are you decent, are you? You still? Still here, Raquel said, leaning against the wall, her cheek pressed to the cool plaster. Bento is gone. Raquel closed her eyes. He went out, Donna Elietti said. He said he was going to the council building. He said someone had to. He said he was going to make them look. When? An hour ago, maybe 2. I have been trying to find someone awake. Raquel opened her eyes. The fan turned. Radio, on its low afternoon loop, said something about patience. Somewhere, far off, there was the long, low note the ships sometimes made when they shifted in their hover. A sound she had at first thought was thunder, and then thought was singing, and then stopped thinking about because thinking about it did things to the inside of her head. Anna Elliot, she said. Do you have water? A little. Drink it, I have been saving it. Drink it, all of it. Right now. Then knock on the wall again and tell me you have. There was a pause. Then the small wet sound of an old woman drinking, and then the knock 3 times hard. Good, Raquel said. Now lie down on the floor with your face on the tile. The tile is cooler than the bed. Do you hear me? I hear you. Lie down. I am going to find Bento. She had not, until she said it, known she was going to. She had not been outside in 81 days. She put on her grandmother's house dress, because it was the loosest thing she owned, and her skin lately did not like being touched. She wrapped her hands in strips of an old sheet because she was not sure her fingers would stay attached to anything they gripped. She took the tin box and tied it shut with twine and put it in a canvas bag. She did not know why she took the tin. She knew dimly that leaving it behind felt like leaving a child. She took the book. She took the sticker, peeled now from the page, and pressed flat against the inside of her wrist. where the sweat would hold it. She did not take a weapon. There were no weapons in the apartment. There had never been weapons in the apartment. Grandmother had said, "Phila, the things in your hands are the things in your heart, so be careful what you carry." She opened the door. The hallway was the color of weak tea. The walls had bowed slightly in the heat, the way old book pages bow, and the floor was tacky under her bare feet. She walked. She passed apartment 406 and tapped the door once and heard faintly an answering tap. She walked down the stairs because the elevator had stopped working in week 6. She passed, on the landing of the second floor, a man she did not recognize sitting against the wall with his straight out in front of him. He was not melting, he was the dry kind of dead, the kind that had simply stopped days ago in the heat. She did not look at his face. She said, "I'm sorry," because her grandmother had taught her to greet the dead. She went out into the street. The light was wrong. It had been wrong for 185 days. But she had forgotten the precise shape of the wrongness. The Verks ships, hanging low, refract the sun into something thicker than sunlight. A coppery, slow-moving light that made the asphalt look like it was breathing. Street was empty. A dog lay in the shadow of a doorway, panting, alive but unable to stand. Raquel walked past it. She wanted to bring it water. She had no water. The smell was the thing she had not been ready for. 6 months of the city baking in its own juice, and there was a sweetness to the air. A thick, stomach-turning sweetness like fruit, left too long in a bowl, layered over the metal smell of hot asphalt and the green smell of plants that had given up, and the sharper smell, every few meters, of something that had been a person and no longer was. She put her wrapped hand over her mouth and walked. Her grandmother, she thought, would have done the same. Her grandmother had walked through worse smells in worse cities, and had not complained, and had told Raquel once that the trick was not to breathe through your mouth, because the mouth was where the soul lived, and you did not want the world's bad smells touching your soul. She walked toward the council building. The council building was 4 blocks. In the old world, before the ships, 4 blocks had been a thing she did not think about. A thing she walked while reading texts on her phone. A thing that took 6 minutes and left her with no memory of having walked it. She thought about this now. She thought about how the old world had been a place where you could move without your body being the subject of the movement. She thought about how, since the ships, she had become aware of her body the way an animal in a trap becomes aware of its leg. A piece of her right cheek slid down and stopped at her jaw. She kept walking. She passed the bakery where her mother had bought bread on Saturdays. The windows were broken. Inside, on the counter, a row of loaves sat where someone had set them out on the morning of the first day, and forgotten. They had not rotted in the usual way. They had cooked slowly into something like brick. She thought, looking at them, "We have all been baking." She passed, on the second block, a small shrine that someone had built on the corner. A stack of bricks, a candle long since melted into a flat disc of wax, a photograph of a young man under a piece of broken glass, and beneath the photograph, in pencil on a torn page from a notebook, the words, "Renato, 19 annos." Who tried, she did not know who Renato was. She did not know what he had tried. She stopped, briefly, and put her wrapped hand on the bricks, and said quietly, "I am sorry, Renato, and I see you tease," because her grandmother had taught her to greet the dead, and had also taught her that there were 2 kinds of greeting. One for the dead you had known, and one for the dead you had not, and the second one was the more important one, because the dead you had not known had no one else. She kept walking. On the 3rd block she passed a woman sitting in a window. The woman was perhaps Raquel's age. She was not melting. She was the kind of intact that meant she had a council shirt drying somewhere in her apartment, or a brother who did, or a husband who did. She watched Raquel pass. Their eyes met. The woman in the window did not look away. She did not either smile or nod or do any of the small things a person in a window does to a person in the street. She only watched. And Raquel, walking, understood that the woman was making a decision, was, in the small private theater of her face, deciding whether she would later tell anyone what she had seen. Raquel did not know which way the decision went. She kept walking. She decided to assume the better answer, because, deciding to assume the worse one would not change the woman's choice, and would change the walking. And the walking was the thing she could control. The council building had armed guards at the door. They were human. They were dry. They wore the short sleeves of the broadcast men. They had the careful, neutral faces of men who had been told repeatedly that they were doing important work. One of them raised a hand as she approached. "Citizen, return to your residence. The acclimation period is ongoing." Raquel stopped. She looked at him. He was perhaps 23 years old. A small scar on his upper lip, the kind a child gets falling off a bicycle. His eyes were the color of weak coffee. "I am looking for a man," she said. "He came here an hour or two ago. His name is Bento Alcides Ferreira. He is 61. He has a limp from a motorcycle accident in 1987. He came to make you look at him." The guard's face did not move. "There has been no visitor. He came here." "There has been no visitor," Raquel said slowly. "Then where is he?" The guard said nothing. The other guard, the one behind him, looked at the ground. She did not go through the door. She knew, with the clean knowledge a body sometimes has, that going through the door would end her. The door was not the point. The door had never been the point. She turned around. She walked back into the middle of the street, where the coppery light fell hardest, and she sat down. She set the canvas bag in front of her. She untied it. She took out the tin. She opened the tin. She arranged the pieces of herself on the asphalt in front of her in a neat row. The thumb, the teeth, the patch of scalp, the strip of skin from her calf, the piece of her ear, the piece of her cheek which she had picked up on the second block and added in transit. She took out the book. She opened it to the page with no sticker because the sticker was on her wrist now, where it was meant to be. She began to read aloud. She read about Fabiano and Sinha Vittoria and the dog Balea walking through the dry country under a sun that wanted them dead. She read in the steady voice her grandmother had used, the voice that did not hurry, the voice that treated each sentence like a stone laid in a path. She did not raise her voice. She did not shout at the building. She did not look at the ships. She sat in the middle of the road, with the small wet pieces of her body laid out in front of her, and she read. The guards looked at her. They did not move. They had not been trained for this. They had been trained for shouting men and rocks and bottles. They had not been trained for a woman reading a novel to the asphalt. After a while, a window opened on the second floor of the building. A face appeared. Then another. Then a door. Not the front door, a side door, opened, and a small, thin woman in a cleaner's uniform stepped out, looked at Raquel, and sat down on the curb to listen. The cleaner had a name tag that said Rosa. She had been mopping a corridor on the 4th floor when she had heard, faintly, through an open window, a woman's voice reading. She had walked toward the voice the way a person in a desert walks toward the sound of water, not deciding to, only doing it. After a while longer, Donna Eliette from 406, who had not been outside in 91 days, came down the street and sat down beside Raquel and said nothing. Onlysa listened, her hands folded in her lap, a small dark patch on her dress where her left breast had begun to soften. She had walked on legs that should not have carried her the 4 blocks from the apartment building. She would not afterwards remember how. She would only remember that the reading had been louder, somehow, than her body's objections, and that she had followed it the way you follow a smell of bread when you are hungry, without strategy, without thought. After a while longer, a young man Raquel had never seen before came around the corner carrying a kitchen chair and set the chair down and sat in it and put his hands on his knees and listened. He was perhaps 20. He had been in the old world a student of engineering. He had carried the chair because he had thought, walking, that the woman in the road might want it. And then when he got there, he had seen that she was sitting on the asphalt by choice, and had not wanted to interrupt the choice. And so he had sat in the chair himself, holding the small private regret of a young man who has misunderstood a situation, but is, nonetheless, present in it. The light kept being wrong. The ships kept breathing. Radio voice, drifting from open windows up and down the street. The same broadcast, the afternoon loop, said, "The council reminds residents that the atmospheric recalibration is proceeding within projected parameters." Raquel read, "It is here that the men who wrote the suppressed paper, later, would say the Verks made their mistake. Not a mistake of strategy, not a mistake of force, a mistake of attention." The Verks, in their breeding cycles, listened. Not for language. They had no concept of language as humans understood it. They listened for cohesion, for the small electromagnetic signature a tide pool gives off when the creatures in it move together, rather than separately. It was, the paper would say, how they knew when a colony of soft creatures had become organized enough to be a problem. In the way that a tide pool full of synchronized fish is a problem to a wading bird that prefers to eat one at a time. 185 days, the equatorial belt of the third planet had given off no such signature. The soft creatures there had stayed in their boxes. They had melted in private. They had listened to the radio. They had not synchronized. The Verks detected, on the afternoon of the 186th day, in a small street in what had been Recife, was not a riot. 'Twas not a weapon. It was a low, steady human signal, the rhythm of a woman reading aloud, and the slowed breath of 4 people, then 7, then 15, then 40 listening. Synchronizing, slowly to the cadence of her sentences, beats settling into the same long rhythm, lungs moving together, a small cohering thing. The Verks had not expected this. The Verks had expected, if anything, fire. They were prepared for fire. They were not prepared for a novel. Raquel finished the chapter. She did not stop. She turned the page. She kept reading. The voice had begun, somewhere around the 3rd page, to do something strange, to stay steady even as her throat softened, to hold its shape even as her lower lip went slack. It was not, she thought distantly, her voice anymore. It was her grandmother's. It was the voice that had said, "The world will try to cook you. Don't let it." And it was reading now the way her grandmother had read. And there was no part of Raquel that wanted to interrupt it. The crowd grew. They came down from the apartments. They came out of the bakeries and the shuttered shops. They came in their grandmother's house dresses and their father's undershirts. They came carrying the small tins of themselves, the pieces, the teeth, the strips of skin, and they set the tins down in front of them, and they sat in the road, and they listened. Some of them wept, most of them did not. There was a silence around the reading, the way there is a silence around a midwife working. The guards at the council building stood at the door, with their rifles slack at their sides. The young one with the bicycle scar was crying. He was crying quietly the way a man cries when he has not yet given himself permission to. The other one, the older one, set his rifle down on the steps and walked into the crowd and sat down with his back to his post and put his face in his hands. Above them, the nearest of the 3 ships made the long, low note again. It was not, this time, a settling note. It was different. It was, and Raquel would think about this for the rest of her life. Uncertain. A great breathing thing, leaning slightly forward, trying to understand what it was looking at. The radio in the open windows kept its loop. Provisional council, in the building behind the guards, did not come out. They could be heard, faintly on the upper floors, arguing. She read until the sun moved. She read past the place where Balina the dog dies, which had always made her grandmother stop and wipe her eyes with the back of her wrist before continuing. Kel did not stop. She did not have eyes to wipe. Her left eye had gone soft an hour ago, sliding fractionally, and she had stopped seeing through it. She read with the right eye on the page. She read about the family walking on, after the dog, into the dry country. When she finished, she closed the book. She set it on the asphalt in front of her, on top of the tin of her own pieces. She looked up. The street was full. There were perhaps 300 people. They were sitting or kneeling or standing very still. They were not chanting. They were not shouting. They had not yet, as far as she could tell, decided what they were. She said, in her own voice, her voice not her grandmother's, "We are still here." It was not loud. The people near her heard it. They passed it back. "We are still here. Still here." It moved through the crowd the way a small wave moves through a tide pool, not breaking, not crashing, only carrying. The ship made the low note again. Then, and this was the thing the suppressed paper would not be able to explain, because the paper had not accounted for it, the ship lifted. Not high, not fast. Just enough that the coppery light on the street thinned, fractionally, and the temperature, fractionally, dropped. A degree, maybe 2. The kind of difference a person who has been baking for 186 days feels in their bones before they feel it on their skin. Child somewhere in the crowd said, "Mamai." A woman somewhere in the crowd said, "Oh." Raquel did not move. She knew, with the clean knowledge a body sometimes has, that moving now would break it. That what was happening was a thing being measured, on the other end, by something that did not have a face she could read and did not have a language she could speak. And the only correct response was to keep being what she had become. A small cohering thing, sitting in the road, refusing to be a tide pool. The ship lifted again. The second ship, 2 kilometers north, lifted in answer. Third ship, over the harbor, did not move. It stayed. Stay, in fact, for another 9 days, while the first 2 repositioned and recalculated and, eventually, in a long, slow, baffled withdrawal that the xenobiologists would spend 20 years trying to understand, left. But on that afternoon, in that street, the temperature dropped 1 degree, and then another, and a small, thin wind moved through Recife for the first time in 6 months, and Raquel, on the asphalt, took a breath that did not feel like swallowing soup. She began very quietly to laugh. She did not live. It is important, the historians would later say, to be honest about this. Raquel lured Ferreira de Almeida, who had been a high school literature teacher before the ships came, and whose grandmother had been a washerwoman in the Sertão, did not survive the afternoon of the 186th day. She had lost too much. Cohering thing she had made in the street had cost her the last of what was holding her together. And she went, in the end, the way a candle goes, not dramatically, only smaller and smaller, until she was a wick, and then she was not. The young guard with the bicycle scar carried her body off the asphalt at dusk. He carried it the way a man carries his own mother. The tin of her pieces went with her. The book went with her. The Star Wars sticker, peeled from her wrist by the older guard with great care, was placed inside the front cover of the book, beside her grandmother's name, where it remains to this day. The crowd did not disperse. They stayed in the street. They brought chairs. They brought their own books. They read aloud, in shifts, for 9 days, while the third ship hung over the harbor and did its slow, uncertain work of leaving. Provisional Council came out, eventually, with their hands raised. There were trials. There were later other things. None of that is the part of the story that matters. The part that matters is this. The Verks did not lose to weapons. They were not driven out by fleets, or by bombs, or by clever generals. They were driven out. The suppressed paper would eventually conclude, when it was at last published, by a thing they had not anticipated and could not classify. A small, soft creature, partly dissolved, sitting in a road, reading a book in her dead grandmother's voice to a crowd of other small, soft cries who had decided, for no military reason, and against every available incentive, to listen. Paper called it anomalous cohesion under terminal stress. The people in the equatorial belt called it Raquel. In the years that followed, in the slow rebuilding of the cities the ships had cooked, a thing began to happen in the schools. Children, when they were taught to read, were taught from Vidas Secas. They were taught to read it aloud. They were taught to read it slowly, the way a stone is laid in a path. Taught that the book had been the weapon, and that the voice had been the weapon, and that the small cohering rhythm of people breathing together had been the weapon, and that none of this had been an accident, and that none of it had been a miracle, and that all of it had been a woman in a house dress, in a road, doing the most ordinary thing a human being can do. The teachers, when they taught this, would sometimes, at the end of the chapter, when Balia dies, stop and wipe their eyes with the back of their wrists before continuing. It was not, they explained to the children, a thing to be ashamed of. It was in fact the point. Years later, a Verks, one of the few who would ever attempt to communicate with the species they had nearly cooked, was asked, through layered translation, what they had heard on that afternoon, what had made the ship lift. The answer, translated and retranslated, and finally rendered into something approximate, was this: a signal we had not measured for, a rhythm that did not belong to a tide pool. We had thought you were many. On that day, we understood you were one. The translator, when she rendered this into Portuguese for the broadcast, paused. She was an old woman by then. She had been, on the 186th day, 14 years old. And she had been sitting on the curb 3 meters from Raquel, listening, with a piece of her left forearm in a handkerchief in her lap. She said, into the microphone, in her own voice, They thought we were a tide pool. We were a choir. Then she sat back from the microphone, and she did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say. Outside the studio, in the cooled equatorial city, the children walked home from school with their books under their arms, and the long afternoon light, ordinary now, fell on them the way light is supposed to fall on a person, gently, and without ambition, and without wanting anything from them at all.